Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being so prompt. I think we've had basically everyone turn up that said they were going to come by 2 minutes past, so that's fantastic. So thank you very much for that. For lots of new people today, so for those that don't know me, I'm James Lucas, the CEO of Cirrus HQ and AWS consulting partner based just outside of Edinburgh. I'm also the founder and one of the organizers of the AWS user group Edinburgh. Today we've got one of my colleagues, John Walker, to talk about delivering full stack apps with AWS Amplify Studio and Figma. I'll let John introduce himself a bit, but just to give a bit of background, John is our head of architecture. He is an AWS partner ambassador, an AWS community builder, a well-architected ambassador, and probably several more things. So I'll let him get on talking in 1 second, but just to say that we are recruiting quite a bit at the moment. So if these kind of things are interesting to you and you would like to know more, please reach out to John or me afterwards, or have a look on our website where there is several roles available. But on that note, the only other thing to add is, as per the screenshot at the moment, if you have questions you'd like to ask, please fill them in as you go along via the questions section in the GoToWebinar bar, and we will have a Q&A section at the end. Thank you very much. I'll hand you over to John.
Thanks, James. So yeah, just a quick bit about myself before we get started. As James mentioned, I'm lead at the Cirrus HQ. I just realised I need to put my head of architecture on the slide. So I'm a AWS ambassador and community builder. I've recently joined the community builder program, and I've got 6 of the certifications with AWS, and that includes the Solutions Architect Professional and DevOps Professional, and just a few details here about where I talk about technology, etc. And we'll just get straight into it. So one thing I just want to preface this with, we'll be discussing full stack applications and how AWS Amplify and Amplify Studio can help you develop applications, but I'm by no means a front-end developer. I'm not a designer, but I can get by. But if you see any of the code later on and realize, oh, well, why aren't you doing it this way? It's minimal viable product at this point, just to kind of demonstrate the capabilities. So just in terms of Amplify itself, so Amplify is a service from Amazon that allows you to do full stack applications, and it's built within the AWS console, and it handles a lot of the complexity of deploying onto AWS, especially when you get into some of the best practices. So things like using infrastructure as code, having continuous integration and deployment pipelines, and setting up things like DynamoDB. All of that can be quite complicated. Amazon tend to give you a lot of the tools to build what you need, but Amplify and Amplify Studio are services that bring a lot of that together and give you a nice visual way of doing full stack development on Amazon. So Amplify itself contains a number of features. So you have things like it'll handle authentication for you. You can have data stores like DynamoDB, analytics, APIs, the Lambda functions, location features. There's a lot of different things in Amplify itself, and the way they've built it is that these are components. So when you build an app on Amplify, whether that's a website or a mobile application, you can then build these different features into it, and it all connects to the same application and backend that you've already built. So for example, if you wanted to add analytics on, you're not starting from scratch, you're starting from your already existing application, and it'll tie into the authentication, it'll tie into your functions and data that you're getting from your existing customers. Now, Amplify itself is the service that underlies the studio that we're going to discuss. And the reason that Amazon have added in this Amplify Studio is it allows you to take what you would do in Amplify and have multiple different people collaborate on it without having to go into the AWS console itself. So it's all about making things simpler and having a nice visual way of doing the full stack development on Amplify. So if you're just using Amplify directly, then you would need an AWS console user. There's a bit more complexity in there. It maybe goes into a bit more detail than you actually need just to work on the application. And Amplify Studio used to be called the Admin UI within Amplify, but they've changed it and added a lot of new features in there as well. So contains this visual backend builder, so allows you to deal with things like user management, data, components, which is one of the main things we're going to be talking about today, and all the different services that you can hook into your application. It can also be extended by CDK. So that's Amazon's Cloud Development Kit. So that allows you to take what's already in Amplify Studio and add your own integrations into it. If you've got something you've already built you want to use, so you have a machine learning model you want to integrate with it, you can use CDK to hook those two things together. The Amplify also provides a number of libraries, so a lot of this will be for user interface development, for connecting with the various different services. So there are Amplify libraries, for example, for using GraphQL, which is one of the features that Amplify offers. Then there's a new component library. So this is in the screenshot here, if you can see it, there's a UI library. And this is what I'll be going through in the demo today of how you can use an external application called Figma to design your components and then bring them into Amplify and sync them with your application in a really smooth way. So that integration itself is currently in preview, which means that it's not really recommended for production, but it's good to get a flavour of it just now. And then probably sometime this year, Amazon will move it into general availability, and they'll incorporate any feedback from users that are working through it just now. So there's a few other tools here. So the environment management is, I'll go on to in a second and actually show the demo of the front and back end environments. And the collaboration tool just means you can use Amplify Studio on its own domain, or you can actually integrate it with your own domains. And that way you handle the authentication of your users outside of the AWS console. So you essentially, if you want to work on an application and say you want to make some data changes or add in some components, you don't need to learn the full AWS console and where everything is just to do that. So just a quick overview of what it's actually going to deploy in the background. So Amplify Studio and Amplify itself will deploy a number of potential front ends, which will then hook up to your Git repository. So that can be GitHub, Code Commit, and a few other ones. Then it will also deploy a backend, which runs on containers, and that will take care of all the different connections to services like S3 for static hosting, DynamoDB, Lambda. And when it does this, it basically takes away a lot of the complexity for you. So for example, to deploy a DynamoDB and set up a data model for it, you don't really need to do any of the CloudFormation that you would normally do, or any of the setup that you would do manually if you were going to set up yourself. So it'll deploy all that for you. Then when you're actually developing on the application, you use the Amplify Studio itself and your local development and Git repository in combination to actually develop your application. And I'll show an example of that once we get to the demo section. So the integration with Figma is really useful, because Figma's, for those that you aren't familiar with it, it's a way of designing components for websites and in a very visual manner, but also in a structured way. If you can see this example here, this is essentially like a blog post that's based on one of the component libraries that Amazon provides. It's actually meant to be like a social element, so something like Twitter or Facebook. I've modified it here just to have a title and a body text, and all this is actually hierarchically designed. So you've got the body, the frame, all the different elements that you would use on the front end to design. You build that in Figma, and then the integration with Amplify will turn that into a component for you for your front end. So it will build a React component for you, or it'll build a Flutter component, for example. And you can use this to visually design everything and get everything the way you need to, and then integrate it into your application without having to code it from scratch, essentially. And I'll show you later on how that links up with things like DynamoDB. So on the authentication side, you can actually use Amplify to create authentications for your users. So you can show them a login page, and then you can give them features that are only available to that user. So you can use different services. The sort of standard ones, your normal email sign up. You can also use a phone number sign up as well, and both of those are password based. If you're already using Amazon Cognito service, then you can import that and use the Cognito user pools from there. And you can also integrate with other services like you've got sort of Google sign in, Facebook, Amazon sign in as well, and sign in with Apple. So for these, some of them you can use on the web and applications, but for things like signing in with Apple, that's usually for the actual applications as well. So if you're using something like React Native and building an application there, then signing in with Apple is a good way of doing that. I think you can also use it on websites as well, but primarily it's for the applications. And quickly just on the actual data. So typically Amplify and Amplify Studio use DynamoDB as their data store, and they provide this data modeling interface, which allows you to actually show what data you've got there and design how it's going to be stored. So you can, in this case, the screenshot I've got here is from the demo we're going to do. It's just a basic entry with it says emulating a blog post essentially. So you've got an ID, a title, and a comment. So that's the body of the text. You can then set up as much data as you need there, and you can put in things like specific field types. You can add relationships, and all of this is deployed into DynamoDB, but it's also deployed as a GraphQL model as well. So that allows you to query your data and query different parts of your application, but also allows you to modify things as well. So I've got a GraphQL section I'll explain in a second. But this data modeling is really useful rather than having to sort of manually add in fields and columns in DynamoDB. You can use this visual editor to show how things actually relate to each other and add different fields. And this is a sort of really powerful feature of Amplify. So in the content management section, once you've got your data set up, then you can use the content management to actually edit data directly in Amplify Studio. So this allows you to do the usual add, edit, search, and download, but it also allows you to auto-generate test data. So this here's from the example I'm going to do where I auto-generated 10 entries for the data model that I'd created. So it's created me individual posts just with random text. And you can actually put constraints on that as well to say, okay, I only want 10 letter words or things like that. Just allows you to actually prototype things a lot quicker. But one of the good features of this, of having the content management, is you don't need to actually then have a separate admin interface. So you can lock down specific data to specific users. And if you want to go in and change a setting for the application, you already have that built into Amplify Studio. You don't need to create a completely separate admin user interface just to change some of the values in the application. And you can also use Amplify Studio to store data for the user in terms of files. So, for example, if you've got users and you want to allow them to upload an avatar, or if your application involves them uploading files, you have that integration with Amplify Studio, and you can build it directly into your application with code that Amplify will generate for you, and that will be backed by S3, and you get all the features of S3 in terms of locking down different users, seeing where the the data is actually going to go. You get different folders for each user, etc. And then you can use the interface to interact with those, so creating files, reading, update, etc. The standard interactions you would normally get with S3. But this allows you to have a sort of data storage layer on your application for your own features, but also actually have your users upload to your application files that they might need to. And if you need a bit more processing in terms of business logic or things that you want to integrate with some other providers, say you have a back-end API that you want to use, you can actually use functions within Amplify Studio, and that will link to AWS Lambda. And then from there, Lambda, you can write that in multiple different languages. It will integrate with anything that Amazon has, essentially. But you can also use this to interact with GraphQL. So I'll come on to that in a second. There's quite a good section on what you get out of GraphQL. So within Amplify Studio, it allows you to automatically allow Lambdas to talk to other parts of your application. So normally when you're setting up a Lambda, you need to go through all the different roles and permissions to make sure that your Lambda can talk to DynamoDB, it can talk to S3. All that's handled for you within Amplify Studio. So you set up the function and your application will be allowed to speak with the Lambda, and the Lambda will be able to speak with different areas in your application. You can also use Lambda layers, which is a standard feature of Lambda to allow you to reuse code, so you can package up different modules and have them available to all of your different functions. So you have if you have common sets of code, you put them in a layer, and then you don't need to repeat that within every Lambda. And you can use things like Secrets Manager to store potentially sensitive information, whether that's API keys or anything that you don't want to have within the application. You can use Lambda to then go and fetch that from Secrets Manager and provide it to your application, so that you don't need to store API keys in your GitHub repository, for example. So in GraphQL, as I was talking about, so GraphQL is a sort of query language that allows you to access data from across your application using a single graph query. So I won't go full into this, but it's actually really useful for doing things like querying the data in your database, and you can use it for updating. Say, for example, if you wanted to create a new image in S3, you can actually use GraphQL to do that as a modification. And it allows you to get different bits of information from all the places in your application that it may have data stored, and have that in one place. So you do one query and you get everything back that you might need. So you can also use it to interact with sort of authentication, functions, predictions, which we'll come to in a second, and even you can use storage. So there's a modification to create files example. So but one of the good things with Amplify Studio and AppSync is the GraphQL service under the hood. You can actually use it to auto-generate the queries that you might need. So I've got an example of that where the data model that I've set up, I basically ran a command to auto-generate queries, and it's given me create, read, update, and delete functions for every piece of data that I've got in there, so or every part of the data model. So that way you can just call those functions and get the data back without having to figure out how to write the GraphQL queries. And another important place that you can actually add in analytics. So Amplify Studio integrates with Amazon Pinpoint, which is Amazon's service for user analytics, for sort of notifications and interacting with users. And once you actually have these integrated, you can have a look at all the different sort of touch points within your application. So you can see some examples here of how many active users you have, how long they stay. In this case, you have a purchases section. So did they get all the way through the process? and sort of where they were in the heat map of, like, on a Wednesday at 1 p.m. for example, is that your really busy time. You can use this to really break down what's actually happening in your application. It also integrates with Kinesis streams, which allows you to generate sort of click data and have that stream through to different areas within Amazon. That only works with the JavaScript integration of Amplify Studio at the moment, but I believe that probably will come for a few other different front-end applications. So that allows you to just sort of see what's going on in your app and figure out anything that's actually happening. And Amplify Studio also allows you to access a lot of the AI and ML services within AWS that don't require ML knowledge. So you can use it for things like using for translations, Poly is your text-to-speech, transcribe is the other way, speech to text, and one good one here but is the recognition. So you can use the predictions API to identify unsafe images. So if you get an image uploaded to your application, you can run it through the prediction and it'll tell you whether or not it's an image that really shouldn't be there. So you can actually automatically delete that, and you don't need to get people going through and manually figuring out whether, like, images are not really suitable for your application. So there's a lot of different services you can interact with, but one of the last one, two more here, and then we'll go into the demo. You can actually integrate a chatbot as well using Amazon Lex and integrate that through Amplify. So we've got this example here where it's set up a different audiences it's going to be looking for, and then figure out what you're going to do based on that. So if someone mentions they want to order something, then there's a particular route you can down, and integrate with different parts of the application. And this example here is the code that it generated for you to demonstrate this. So you have a user input here, someone saying, I want to reserve a hotel. Then you send that over to the Amazon Lex integration, and it'll come back with the response. So you're using the API to interact with Lex, and it's all done through Amplify. And just lastly here, there's an integration with React Native for sort of Android and iOS applications, where you can integrate with the native notification services. So you can use Amazon Pinpoint, so you can trigger a notification, send that through your application using the native integration. So in this case, it's the Apple push notification service, and then that will show up on the device, and you can use that to interact with your users. So that was a quick run through some of the features. So a second, I'm just going to, now what we'll do is actually take you through the Amplify console as a demo. So what I've got here is I've got a demo set up where all I've essentially done is created a React application using the templates, then initialize the Amplify within that, and that allowed me to create a backend environment, which is here, and I've actually created two front-end environments. So one of these is linked to a GitHub repository as a stage branch, and the other one's linked to a main repository. So within the backend, you've got this launch studio here, and that will actually launch the Amplify Studio as well. There are a few other settings in here that I just wanted to mention quickly, of things like the domain management. So you can actually link a URL to each of the front-end environments that you've set up. You can also link a domain to the Amplify Studio itself, so you can host that on your own domain. And within this build settings here, this is how it will actually control when your front end's submitted to be deployed. You'll use this amplify.yaml to put in the commands that will actually run through, in this case it's npm, but you can use like yarn and whatever your actual build process is, you can put into this section. So and what this will do is when the applications comes in to be deployed, this will run and actually build your application and then allow it to be deployed into into a container for the back end. So it will actually deploy both the front and back end based on the one integration from the CI/CD pipeline. So I just wanted to show there. And there's a few other places you can use here. So you can set up previews as well, so that if you've got a pull request going from one branch to another, you can use previews to automatically generate a new environment to show that preview without it being in one of your main branches. So if someone wants to see what's actually happening with a pull request or what changes that will make to the site, you don't need to actually fully merge it in. You can use this pull request in preview section to show what it would actually do. And then, as I mentioned, in the back end, this is where you'll see this in the studio. So I've got this open here. So the studio itself has got all the different sections that I've went through there. So you have things like your data modeling, where you can change all the data that you want to put in and then deploy that. And one of the things is in the top right hand corner here, you'll see usually you'll have different setup instructions, or whatever you were last using, there'll be a notification here of the next steps that you need to do. So Amplify Studio is quite good of giving you the commands that you need to run to be able to use certain things. So as an example, I'll go next section. I'm going to show us this UI library. So you can actually, it's got the Amplify pool here, and that will actually go and get the components. So each of the different sections here are the ones that I've kind of went through, and the way Amplify Studio set up is quite modular. So it's got each of these sections will have the instructions that you need to do for that particular area. So it usually tells you, so install the CLI, pull the Amplify project, which is essentially you syncing with Amplify Studio for any changes that are in there. And then you can add the functional capabilities. So it'll give you the code and you can just copy it here. So it's usually quite straightforward in Amplify Studio of what you need to do as the next steps. And the main one I kind of wanted to show is this UI library. So what I'll quickly do is just kind of show what I've ended up with. So this is it's a very basic React application, and all it's actually doing is showing each of these components as part of a collection. So this is a component that I've done in Figma, synced it with Amplify Studio, and then all I needed to do was call that within the React application. And I'll show the code for that is essentially generated that code. So within the UI library, we've got this component which just came from Figma, and then what I've done is created this collection from it. So it allows you to show multiple versions of that component linked to the data that's in DynamoDB. So I have 10 entries in there just now, and it's currently showing the all 10 entries. And I didn't need to create any of this. So once I created the component, there's a setting just to create it into a collection. So if we go to configure here, so you can just do create collection and it'll create multiples of that. So before I go through this, I'll actually just quickly go into Figma. So this is kind of what I showed before. It's just a very basic blog post essentially of what I was trying to show. But what this does is it allows you to, you've got each of the different sections and you can change the framing, change all the details. So one of the examples I did here is I changed the font to bold here. So the original one didn't have bold, and then I synced it through. And this number here, I've actually just put this in. I'm going to use this as a sort of small demo of how the process actually works. So once you've got the detail in here, what we need to do is copy the link from share, and then you can use, if you wanted to do, so if I do the sync just now, this will get the existing ones, but you can add in a new one as well. So when you sync to your file in Figma, it'll go through and say, okay, you can see I've added this one in here now, so that's the updated version. You can see side by side exactly what's changed. Now, this is in previous, so there's a couple of these errors here, so it's not quite found the right components with the icon and the divider, but it has imported them, so it's recreated them for you. So if that all looks fine, you can accept it and then save the components within Amplify Studio. So now you can see that one in here is now in both the component and the collection. And what I want to do now is configure this. So what I want to actually have happen is, for this demo, is this, the number that we've got here. So sorry, it seems to have frozen a bit. I was doing a live demo. So if I now go to configure, so what I want to do is this component that we've just added in, I want to actually bind that to the data. Now, the first step of doing that is within the overall. This is linked to this posts. So this is part of my data model, and that's the table that I set up in the data section. And then within this number, what we do is set this text label to the ID of that post. Just give me a sort of random number, but these are, I'm just showing this just to show that you can actually, how you can link data together. So if I just do that, then now that I've actually got in there, this, so excuse it being a number. Now that we've actually got that in there, what we can do is pull that into our React application. So if I just quickly show this. So in Visual Studio Code here, what I've got is, I've got the Amplify built in here. Then within the source code, I've got, as I say, I won't go through the full details of this, but within the React application, I've got the collection that I've created, and then all I've done is included that within the application. So that these parts here are essentially the main Amplify parts. And within the overall index, there's a few extra things you need to do to import the Amplify React code, the styles, and essentially configure it. So this provider and config, this will set up the connection to Amplify for you. And that will include everything from the DynamoDB to the components. And then you've just got you wrap the application in an Amplify provider. And that's all essentially you need to do for the React component. So in a terminal, what I need to do then is the code that we had before in the Amplify Studio, all I need to do is do an Amplify pull. And what that will do is it'll link to Amplify, figure out what's changed in the back end or the components or data model or any part of it that we've done in Amplify Studio. And then it will sync that data down to your checked out repository. So for example, so here it's went through and it's got the GraphQL area, so where it had been generated. Now it's synced to UI components. And if I just do npm start and show this in a local window, that should show. So now it's showing each of the posts with the ID in there. So it doesn't look very good because it's a long string, but that's where the idea comes from of when you're making changes, all you need to do is change it in Figma and design it as you need to. Then sync that within Amplify and pull it down into your code and run it, and that will be as part of your application. And then to actually get that on to a deployment, if I just close this, then I would basically just add it to my Git repo. And when you're doing this in real, do a better comment than that. So that's now pushed to my repository, which is a staging branch. And if I go into the Amplify console, you'll see that it's already kicked off a deployment of that application. So this will take about sort of 10 minutes, just because it's going through the build process, building everything from scratch. But at the end, I'll come back to this, and you should be able to see this version will have updated to be the same as this one with the ID on the end. And yeah, I think that's kind of the majority of, well, to say there's a few different areas that we can go through, but one of the things I just wanted to show is while I was in the process of setting this up, I took a few screenshots just to kind of show the process of setting Amplify up and the different options that you get, because obviously this is already set up. Don't really have time today to go through the full process, so just wanted to show these screenshots quickly of the process itself. So when you're setting up the front end hosting environment, you can link your application to various different providers. So you can do sort of GitHub, which is what I've done here. You can Bitbucket, GitLab, and Code Commit as well. Then once you've linked to your repository, you can choose a particular repository and this particular branch. And you can even do mono repos with specific folders linked to the CI/CD pipeline. Then you choose which app you're going to deploy it into, the environment that you're going to use on the back end, so which one you're going to link together. And then there's a setup here to do a service role just to allow Amplify to deploy for you. And then this is everything that you've got in terms of a review before it's deployed. And then when you hit save and deploy, that will create the new front-end environment for you. And when you're first doing Amplify, there's this section at the top that will guide you through a number of different things that you can do with Amplify to sort of add new features. So you do the first setup, and there's sections here on using a custom domain with free SSL. You can use test versions, so this is linking a feature branch. You can set password protection on different environments. So say, for example, if you've got a staging environment and you only want your developers to access that, you can password protect the full site. And the other one I showed you is the pull request previews, so that you can actually see what's happening. And you can set up it's called a synthetic canary, which will do 24/7 monitoring of broken links, make sure things are working. You can actually get it to do tests all through your application as well. So, and this is just the overview of what it looks like when you first set up. The data model, and then when you're deploying it, you get the deploy screen. Then when it's been deployed, you get this screen to show your deployment's actually in progress just now, and it's telling you what's happening. But when this is happening, you will get messages in the other parts of Amplify Studio to say that there's a deployment currently ongoing. So you can't, for example, go in and change the data model while there's a deployment happening, just to protect you from making changes and you're not quite sure if they're live or not. The interface will actually take care of that for you to say, hey, you need to kind of stop just now while we're deploying this new model. And as I mentioned, we've got the sync with Figma. So this was the original sync that I did before I changed any of the bold or the image. So with the image, I actually just linked that directly to an existing image, but you can also use URLs within your database, for example, and have the images come from each individual post. At the moment, I've just linked it to one image as a static link rather than a dynamic data link. And yeah, that's a preview. One thing I just wanted to show here was whenever you're logging into Amplify from the command line, so I'm obviously logged in just now already, but when you want to do the Amplify pull, you get redirected to the website and ask if you want to log in, and it will authenticate you based on your login to Amplify Studio. So you don't need to deal with the actual, like, okay, how do I get the AWS keys within my terminal? It redirects you to the application to log in the CLI, which is a really nice feature, saves a lot of steps. So this was one of the first sections I set up. So it'll ask you sort of for things like your default editor, which framework you're going to be using. So I've got JavaScript and React here, and you can set up different sections like where's your source code going to be, where's your build going to be, what commands are you going to use to actually build and start, and then it'll do a lot of that for you. And you're essentially just answering a few questions, and it will generate all the configuration you need. And then same with what we're doing just now, the deployment. It will actually go through and provision, build, and deploy for you, and verify at the end. And to mention, this is the content where I've auto-generated different entries. And this is one of the ones I want to show as well, where when you've created the component and linked it in, then it'll give you instructions for how to set up a CLI, how to install the React components for Amplify, but it'll also give you the code that you need to add into your application and tell you how to wrap it in a provider. So to mention, I'm not a front-end developer, and I've used React a little bit before, but this simplified it a lot for me of actually how to get the Amplify components into a React template essentially and have that up and running without really having to write a lot of code actually. And so you can actually concentrate on writing the React code for the application rather than writing code for how to do the integration. And the last one here was just I was going to show the GraphQL. So I'd ran this command to do code gen and told them using JavaScript, wait to store the files, and it asked me what I actually wanted, whether queries, mutations, subscriptions, and then it generated all that for me. So go back into the code, it created a GraphQL folder here and created all these queries for me. So I've got getting the posts, list, syncing, for mutations, create and update, delete, can even subscribe to particular posts. So all of this is really useful for adding functionality to your application using GraphQL, and I didn't need to write any of this, and it's already there for me of functions you can use to do different parts of GraphQL. And I'll just quickly check. Yeah, actually, I think that has now deployed. And yeah, so this is on the staging environment I created, and the IDs are all now there. So it went from Figma through to Amplify Studio, down to my local development environment, and now is deployed onto the hosting. And that's how easy it is to actually create and update components within Amplify Studio. And to get that into the application, I basically just ran one command to do the sync, and then that was essentially it. There was no extra code to figure out how to add in that new field at the end. And with that, I think we'll open up for questions.
Thank you, John. Fantastic talk, and I'll give you a chance to have another drink and take a breath for a second. A lot you got through there. Yeah. So we've got some questions coming in. So I'll ask these, and please, feel free to ask more questions, and we'll see how we go as we get through them. So First of all, JavaScript got lots of mentions there, but what other languages and frameworks are supported for the front end?
Yeah, there's quite a lot. So Amplify, essentially it'll generate a lot of the API stuff for you. So I'm using React in this case, but you have different integrations. So you have things like Flutter. I think there's a Next.js one in there. I'll just see if I can actually put it easier. So, but yeah, there's quite a lot of different ones that you can use. I think it's generally agnostic in terms of the back end, so you can connect to it with a REST API, but it will generate a lot of code for you for React. You've got React Native, Flutter, and sorry, wait a second. Just trying to remember what the other ones are. So yeah, yeah, I think that's the kind of the main ones.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you. So we've heard lots of good things about Amplify Studio and the difference it makes. Does it have any drawbacks? What's the bad side using what?
Yeah, it's one of the things with these applications where it's building a lot on top of AWS services and simplifying things for you and taking a lot of detail away, does mean that if something goes wrong, it's very hard to figure out what's actually happening. So I actually had an example where, so I had the backend environment set up. Now under the hood, it's CloudFormation, there's Lambdas, there's authentication, there's a lot of stuff it'll do for you. But I had an example where I was trying to launch a studio, but it was kept coming up with the invalid backend, and that was all the information it actually gave me. But what had actually turned out is the lambdas had been deleted underneath it, so part of the CloudFormation was missing. But I had to actually go and figure that out myself within the console. All I was getting was this error saying the backend's not there. So it doesn't really give you a lot of that information where if something goes wrong, you need to kind of go digging into the services itself. But the experience of using it is really good. So there's a trade-off there of when something does go wrong, you do need that extra knowledge of the other underlying applications that it's using.
No, absolutely. And a couple of questions have just come in, and they mirror kind of my own experiences. Linked to that one, I'll ask you both questions because they're kind of related. Can you modify things manually to change the DB from DynamoDB to something else, and if so, how? Kind of going back to the whole, the lambdas got deleted. And similarly, someone looked at Amplify a few years ago, as did I when it first came out, and it's had a huge amount of work done since. I found it difficult to use, which I agree, so did I, and that's why I've not been using it actively since. How do you think things have changed? I mean, I can see at a glance from my own experience, it's a lot more advanced in terms of functionality, but what about you from your experience? And in terms of, and just recapping on how to change things on the back end.
Yeah, it has definitely improved a lot, probably the last year or so, I think. When I first went into it as well, there was a lot less features, and there's a lot of things that were kind of in different places, and you really needed to know where everything was to actually get the best out of it. Whereas now you've got things like this data modeling part is probably the biggest improvement for me, where you can add in your sort of fields and relationships, and it'll just handle that for you. So you don't need to think of it in terms of like, how do I get a particular table set up and get all the details in for that. Now, because I think Amplify is designed to be serverless from the get-go, so it does really use DynamoDB as its main one. I think you can use other things, but it's not going to be as user-friendly or seamless as in the way Amplify Studio is. So, like if you, for example, wanted to use DocumentDB, you could add that in as an integration, but you would need to do the data modeling yourself. You would probably need to handle some of the API calls yourself. but there's nothing tying you into a particular part of Amplify if you want to add in something else, because it's all based on the same underlying sort of application within Amazon. Or so like you've got functions here, and they call them functions, but it's still just Amazon AWS Lambda under the hood, so you can still integrate with anything else. You could still have a MySQL database on RDS, but the connection part of it you need to do yourself.
Yes, they're very much, they're not forcing you in a certain direction, but they're pushing you to, this is the way you want to do it. So that, you know, it makes it a lot
easier for you to use what they've set up, but they won't lock you out anything else.
Understood. A big question for lots of people. What's the cost?
Well, Amplify and Amplify Studio themselves are free. Essentially, what you're doing is paying for what the resources you're using underneath. So you've got the data and you're using DynamoDB, so you'll pay for that. If you've got stuff in S3, you'll pay for that. You'll pay for the Lambda functions running, for example. But the actual Amplify Studio and all the different functionality they've added in here to link different things together, all of that's free.
Great, thank you. And one last one at the moment, unless any come in while I'm asking this question. Let me just make sure I understand it. The front end code is stored in Git, and so is version controlled, and the back end info is configured directly through Amplify. Is there any kind of version control for the back end, and how easy is it to visualize and potentially roll back changes there?
Yeah, I believe so. There is essentially under the hood, it's using CloudFormation. So all of that is actually controlled within the CloudFormation. You can go directly into the CloudFormation stacks and see what it's actually deployed and all the different resources it's using. Now what do you see? So I don't know if there's a really easy way in the console to roll it back, but technically you do have sort of the CloudFormation as well. So if there is something wrong there, then you could potentially roll back through sort of redeploying the other version, but it's mostly going to just be done within Amplify itself, rather than having like a specific repository for each different version of it. So it tries to kind of handle everything for you. So is it going to be based on the studio itself rather than deploying anything?
Yeah, so I know this is one of my questions. If some things with Amazon, you can kind of have a bit of a loop with CloudFormation, because you can define Elastic Beanstalks, correct me if I'm wrong, in CloudFormation, but then Elastic Beanstalk goes and generates CloudFormation to actually do it. So does Amplify support CloudFormation itself, or is it just a generator of CloudFormation? I'm not aware of CloudFormation, but I can't remember.
Yeah, I think you probably could. The one way you could actually do it is with the link into Lambda. You could get that to then kick off a pipeline that would deploy your CloudFormation. So you could have a trigger that way to watch. Like say for example, whenever your backend was deployed, you wanted to run another bit of CloudFormation to deploy something else. You could set that up as a trigger through Lambda to then kick off another CI/CD pipeline that deploys your CloudFormation. Generally, the CloudFormation that's in there, Amplify will handle that for you. It takes control of it. So whenever there's any of these stacks or substacks that need updated, if you were to sort of edit these, then they would probably get overwritten by the auto generation process within Amplify.
Oh, 100%. You don't want to be doing that. You're fairly guaranteed to lose whatever manual changes you made. Thank you. So at the moment, that is the end of the questions, which is perfect timing from the length of the talk. So thank you very much, John. Thank you very much to everyone that's joined us today. If you have any other questions, you can get us in touch with us via the meetup group.
Yeah.
You are members, for those that aren't. It's AWS User Group Edinburgh on meetup.com. Alternatively, you feel free to drop me an email at james@siriushq.com if you'd like to get in touch. But thank you very much. And on that, I will end the webinar.
Before we go, James, there's just one thing I was going to mention. We are going to be sending out a link to a Discord for the AWS Edinburgh User Group, which we're just in the process of setting up, and got any questions we can ask in there. And the other things, the slide and recording for this will be sent out shortly. So if you've missed any of it or you want to send it to a colleague, then that will be available for you.
Great. Thank you very much, John. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.